Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, streaming January 25th, only on Netflix.
A note to listeners, the following podcast contains content that may not be suitable for all audiences.
Now, Texas EQUUSEARCH that I've worked with for Tim Miller for some 20 some odd years, they're probably the largest and most well-known search and rescue volunteer organization, and that's a key word. This is all volunteer. They are a nonprofit, just like CrimeStoppers is. It's a nonprofit.
Yeah, well, we met actually at CrimeCon. We were both speakers presenting there. And, it's no surprise why I would go to him. When BITTAKER had given me the placements of Cindy and Andrea up in the San Gabriel Mountains, I'd reached out to law enforcement and other agencies to no avail. And then I met Andy and heard about the kind of search and recovery that he does. And he's actually done, I think it was just recently, Andy, you did Elmer Wayne Henley's search, right, in Texas?
Yeah, Elmer Wayne Henley, along with his two cohorts, David Owen Brooks and Dean Corll, were given the moniker the Houston mass murderers, and they are generally held responsible for at least 28 murders of young boys in the early 70s. And a lot of people, including myself, Laura, and Tim Miller, believe that there's other bodies out there that haven't been recovered. There was a company in Ohio that, believe it or not, was developing serial killer greeting cards. And they sent Berkowitz a prototype, basically wanting his thumbs up and approval. And Berkowitz shipped the entire package to me. The serial killer greeting card company didn't end up actually producing the cards as a result.
You are listening to Partners in True Crime. We are your hosts, Rob and Cindy Dorfman. If you're enjoying the podcast, please drop us a review on Apple Podcast and Spotify. All you have to do is go to the reviews and let us know what you like about the podcast. It really helps us, and we appreciate it.
Also, if you could follow us on social media at Partners in True Crime. We are on TikTok, X, Instagram, we have a Facebook discussion page, and we're also on YouTube. Please like or subscribe, and you can always go to our website, www.partnersintruecrime.com. There are over 600,000 missing people in the United States, and that number shocks me every time I see it, because this is the United States. This should not be happening here.
Unfortunately, most of the victims are young girls. When we produced the Green River Killer documentary, Gary Ridgway had a list of over 100 victims, and law enforcement does not have the resources to find those victims once the killer is incarcerated.
We've produced a lot of documentaries about missing people. We did the West Mesa serial killings for Discovery ID. We did Up and Vanish for Oxygen, where we had several missing persons cases that we continued on after the show was over. But we learned really quickly how hard it is for families when a loved one goes missing. There really isn't much that they can do.
Which is why Laura's work is so important, because she picks up where law enforcement leaves off and interviews the serial killers while researching the discovery evidence and pinpoints where victims could be located. But without resources, law enforcement is not able to follow up on these leads.
Which is why we're excited today to introduce our guest, Andy KAHAN, the Director of Victim Services and Advocacy at CrimeStoppers Houston. Andy is also a board member of Texas EQUUSEARCH.
Before we bring Andy on, we wanted to give you some backstory on two of the cases we're going to be discussing today with Laura and Andy. Two victims of the TOOLBOX killers who have never been found, Cindy SCHAEFER and ANDREA Hall.
16-year-old Lucinda SCHAEFER was a striking teen with long blonde hair, deep blue eyes, and a beautiful smile. Her nickname was Cindy, and she attracted attention wherever she went.
In the summer of 1979, Cindy's mother went to work at a Christian mission in Mexico and left Cindy with her grandparents in Redondo Beach, California.
Even though it should have been a teenager's dream to live so close to the beach and have access to the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, only 30 minutes away, Cindy was homesick for Wisconsin. She missed her boyfriend and her friends. She really wasn't interested in meeting new people, but her grandparents encouraged her to join the church youth group instead of sitting around the house all day.
Reluctantly, Cindy agreed, and on Sunday, June 24th, 1979, her grandparents dropped her off at St. Andrew's Church for a youth group meeting, and she was bored.
Instead of waiting for her grandparents to pick her up, Cindy decided to walk home, a mistake that would prove to be deadly.
At 7:45 p.m., she began walking up Pacific Coast Highway, where BITTAKER and Norris spotted her, turned around, and began to trail her.
They pulled up ahead of her, and Norris got out of the van pretending to fix something on the tire. When Cindy walked by Norris, BITTAKER snatched her and threw her into the van.
Cindy was only 2 blocks from her grandparents' house.
Later, BITTAKER and Norris confessed to Cindy's murder, but they never revealed the location of her body.
Weeks later, on July 8, 1979, 18-year-old Andrea Hall was at Manhattan Beach with her sister and her young niece and nephew.
Andrea, a feisty, outspoken, beautiful teen with red hair, was upset because she couldn't get in touch with her boyfriend.
There were no cell phones back then, only payphones. Most people weren't sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring.
After trying to call her boyfriend several times and there was no answer, Andrea was frustrated and she decided not to go home with her sister and the kids. Instead, she decided to hitchhike to her boyfriend's house in Torrance, which was only a few miles away.
Back then, it was very normal to hitchhike. People did it all the time, especially along the Pacific Coast Highway,
making it the perfect hunting ground for the TOOLBOX killers. Norris and BITTAKER spotted Andrea outside of a KFC. BITTAKER offered her a ride, and Andrea got in. What she didn't know was that Norris was hiding in the back of the van.
When BITTAKER told her to get some Coca-Colas out of the back, that's when Norris attacked her.
Even though Andrea fought hard to escape, it was impossible, and she was never seen again.
When Norris started investigating Cindy and Andrea's cases, she met with BITTAKER and spent almost 5 years interviewing him.
Before his death, BITTAKER drew Laura a map with the location of Cindy and Andrea's remains. Law enforcement has not searched this area.
But we will. All right, so today we have a guest on that we're familiar with the organization because we've worked with it before, Texas EQUUSEARCH. And Laura surprised us the other day. She says that Andy KAHAN would like to come on the show and talk. And so we were pleased to have him. Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the organization Texas EQUUSEARCH, and what do you do for a living?
So I am a victim advocate. I'm the victim services director at CRIMESTOPPERS. I've been a victim advocate for over 30 some odd years. Prior to that, I was actually a former parole and probation officer. So I chased Houston's finest all over. And in 1992, I became the first advocate, ombudsman, troubleshooter, and trust me, a few other choice words that I was given, staffed out of a mayor's office. Then I went over to Houston Police Department for 8 years, and then CRIMESTOPPERS made me an offer I couldn't refuse to start their program right there. So I've got 30 some odd years of background working with victim advocacy. I serve on the board of Parents of Murdered Children and Surviving Family Members of Homicide, and I serve on the board of Texas EQUUSEARCH as well. Most of my work consists of public policy changes. I've always been of the perspective anybody can yell and scream about the injustices of the world. I would much prefer to find a solution and a remedy. And as a result, I have sponsored, enacted, and pushed over 28 bills in the Texas legislature to effect enhance public safety and victims' rights. So I'm a very, very busy boy.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, because this is exactly what we wanted. We've been talking about this for the past 3 years since we started this podcast. Honestly, the only way we're going to get anything done is for people like you to actually put some of this into action instead of everybody just talking about it. So thank you for coming on. I think it's really important for people to understand what you do and how we as citizens can also contribute to that to make policy changes, because that's what we need.
I've been doing that for 30 some odd years, and every session there's bills that we're up there pushing and pursuing, and it's just incredible what we've been able to accomplish.
Can you just explain to our audience, because we know what Crime Stoppers is and Texas EQUUSEARCH and all the other, can you describe a little bit about what those organizations do?
So Crime Stoppers in Houston, we are actually the largest Crime Stoppers in the country. We're the only Crime Stoppers with its own building. We're the only Crime Stoppers that has a department like mine handling victim services. So we're much more than a tip line. When people think of Crime Stoppers, they think, oh, you call in a tip. Well, yes, we do in Houston because we solved over 30,000 some odd cases, but we also have an experienced staff that works on crime prevention. We're in schools, we do human trafficking, and of course, my department, which is rather unique and extremely new, we've developed programs where we're actually recording victims' families for parole purposes, and we've actually recorded 32 families who will eventually have upcoming parole reviews to make sure that they always have a voice. So there's a lot more to Crime Stoppers, at least in Houston, than just calling in a tip line. And the beauty of Crime Stoppers is that all tips are anonymous. We've solved over 30,000 some odd cases in Houston. Nobody knows who you are. And guess what? You can be eligible for up to a $5,000 reward if your tip actually leads to the arrest of the suspect. Now, Texas EQUUSEARCH that I've worked with for Tim Miller for some 20 some odd years, they're probably the largest and most well-known search and rescue volunteer organization. And that's a key word. This is all volunteer. They are a nonprofit, just like Crime Stoppers is. It's a nonprofit. So all the different organizations that I serve on the board, including Parents of Murdered Children, are all nonprofits. Hence, we rely on fundraising, donation, grants, and the generosity of the public and the business community. So Texas EQUUSEARCH, of course, is nationally known for their searches on the Casey Anthony case, the Natalie Holloway cases, and a multitude of other cases. And they've also helped families recover their lost ones as well. So in addition to finding those individuals who unfortunately have been murdered, they've also helped families actually recover loved ones that end up being alive. So there's a lot that goes on.
Wow, that's awesome. That's awesome. Like I said before we started recording, we are familiar with Texas EQUUSEARCH, and we got acquainted with them on the Molly Miller and Colt Haynes case. Paula Fielder is good friends with Tim Miller, who came out on a few of the searches for her in order to search them in Oklahoma. So, and we were just astonished about the work that these volunteers do in order to bring answers home to the loved ones. Laura, how did you get involved with Andy? And tell us a little bit about your relationship with him.
Yeah, well, we met actually at CrimeCon. We were both speakers presenting there. And, it's no surprise why I would go to him. When BITTAKER had given me the placements of Cindy and Andrea up in the San Gabriel Mountains, I'd reached out to law enforcement and other agencies to no avail. And then I met Andy and heard about the kind of search and recovery that he does. And he's actually done, I think it was just recently, Andy, you did Elmer Wayne Henley's search, right, in Texas?
Yeah, Elmer Wayne Henley, along with his two cohorts, David Owen Brooks and Gene Coral, were given the moniker the Houston mass murderers, and they're generally held responsible for at least 28 murders of young boys in the early 70s. And a lot of people, including myself, Laura, and Tim Miller, believe that there's other bodies out there that haven't been recovered. Hence, that's the connection with Elmer Wayne Henley, who's the only living member of the Houston mass murderers.
Right. And I had interviewed Wayne extensively. So we first started talking about the Elmer Wayne Henley case, and then I had told him about the whereabouts of Cindy and Andrea.
Tell us a little bit about Cindy and Andrea and how they're, just to remind everyone that they're BITTAKER victims.
So Cindy SCHAEFER and Andrea Hall were the first and second victims of BITTAKER and Norris. They were taken to the San Gabriel Mountains where they were raped, tortured, and killed. And they were tossed off the side of the mountain, off the cliff, and they have never been recovered. They still have the metal in their bones. One of BITTAKER's method of killing was putting the ice pick through the ear, and a lot of the times it got lodged in the skull. So it's always been my hope if we go up there and search, and we can actually find them using metal detectors.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys met.
One of the other issues that we actually met and have in common with is this wacky industry that I discovered about 20 years ago, which I infamously nicknamed and coined, called murderabilia, in which we found a thriving market primarily on the internet and underground networks that were selling items connected to serial killers and actually personalized items as well. And in the cases that Laura described with Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, they were probably one of the most well-known individuals that actually had items that are sold on the open market. And believe it or not, I actually have several of their items in the presentations that I do on Murderabilia. I show items that have actually been sold that I've actually accumulated. So for example, I have a pair of Lawrence Bittaker's prison-issued socks. I have probably one of the most unusual Murderabilia items that I've seen for sale, and I have fingernail clippings from Roy Norris. And on the actual clippings, which are attached to an index card, he actually wrote, "It just flabbergasted me that someone would want to collect my fingernails. I've got no objections as long as they don't end up in the hands of a Haitian voodoo priest."
Wow.
So I actually tongue-in-cheek pause, and then I tell the audience, well, guess what, dude? I actually sent your fingernails to a Haitian voodoo priest, and they've got them. So
Good for you.
there's this whole market that Bittaker and Norris were a part of, and that is thriving on the internet. And you have murderabilia dealers that solicit items from high-profile serial killers, mass murderers, school shooters, and high-profile killers, and then they're sold for profit. And that's another thing that we ended up having in common as well.
Having that in common in the sense of trying to stop that.
I've been responsible for having at least a dozen states that have now acted what we call notoriety for profit laws. Most people, including myself, when I found out about this wacky subculture that was being exploited for profit, were of the opinion, or at least the delusion, that we had was called so-called Son of Sam laws, which basically means you can't profit from your crime. But most people still to this day are still unaware that Son of Sam laws were ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court in a famous decision way back in 1991 that involved a mafioso hitman by the name of Henry Hill, who most people will probably remember as a central character in the movie Goodfellas.
The Ray Liotta character.
That was actually modeled after Henry Hill. So what happened was Simon & Schuster offered Hill $250,000 for the rights to their story. And New York Crime Victim Compensation Board sued under the Son of Sam law, went all the way to the Supreme Court, who basically ruled the Son of Sam law unconstitutional because it restricted free speech. So most courts frown on any language restricting free speech. So what we started doing was not going after the issue of free speech, but simply the issue of profiting. That's where we zeroed in. In other words, all you want, scratch, sniff, doodle, paint, whatever. You just don't make any money off it. And that's where we started crafting notoriety for profit laws.
And what was the year of that Supreme Court decision?
1991.
1991. It's interesting because I interviewed Charles Manson, and it was in 1999. And then he was at Corcoran State Prison at the time. And then before they took me in to see Charlie, they took me and they displayed all this artwork that he had done, that's been confiscated. And I said, well, what do you do? And he goes, well, this is the stuff he's trying to get out of the prison. He tries to smuggle it out through correctional officers, inmates leaving the facility, and he tries to get money on his books for it. And it was like a vast array of, scorpions made out of sock thread to paintings.
I actually have Manson's hair that was shaped in the form of a swastika.
Yeah. So it's like, but then the prison policy at that time, and I don't know what it is right now because it's been a while, is they weren't allowed to get that stuff out. That stuff was illegal. It was contraband. So I'm curious to see how if that's still the case, or is it still obviously it's still happening.
It's still happening, but the reality is that serial killers like Manson are basically dying out. There's very few big name serial killers left that are still alive. Really, the biggest name serial killer still alive, believe it or not, is David Berkowitz. So the genre of serial killers is pretty much faded because of technology, and in its place you have your mass murderers and your school shooters. But for the most part, the items are basically shipped out via U.S. mail, and most prisons, from my understanding, because I've been dealing with this industry for 20 some odd years, they're either clueless or they're unaware, or you're dealing with so much volumes of mail that you really can't keep track of everything.
Yeah, we've dealt with that topic, memorabilia, before, and with BTK as well, because we know Kerry Lawson.
And also with Jennifer Carson, whose father was a San Francisco witch killer. And for her, she's been trying to advocate to not allow this to happen in California, but it's been a struggle for her trying to do that. There's been so much material from her dad that's been sold illegally on the internet. It's just, she's been stalked. I mean, it's just horrible.
Oh, for the victims' families that I deal with, the common denominator is it's sickening, it's gut-wrenching, and it's like being punched in your stomach all over again by the criminal justice system. A very well-known victim advocate friend of mine, Mark Klass, whose daughter Polly was murdered by a career habitual criminal Richard Davis, very succinctly put it to me, and he said, my daughter didn't die so Richard Davis can capitalize and make money off of her death.
Exactly.
Yeah, unfortunately it happens. Glad that you're at the forefront of that, because we always wonder every time we talk to people about this stuff, and we see stuff online. Carrie Rawson, it was BTK's daughter, and she would say that they would get contacted by these people with items for her to authenticate. And she would give me a break. Why would I do that? It's like...
No, and again, going back to the common interest that Laura and I have, Laura, of course, interviewing, Laurence Bittaker, but I also have been corresponding and actually met in person and recorded over 2 hours of interviews with none other than David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, on this issue. And in a very strange and unusual alliance, Berkowitz has been one of my biggest supporters and allies. And it's obviously a very unusual relationship, needless to say, but for over 20 years, I have volumes of correspondence between David and I, and we've gone back and forth. He's been an immense help to me because he's so high profile. He's the son of Sam, right? So he gets requests from all these different people, and people that write him, "You're my favorite serial killer, can you send me such and such?" And he ships everything to me. So I get to see how people try to basically, what I call, groom serial killers into sending them items that are then sold on the market without their knowledge or consent. So Berkowitz has been a very big asset for me. And we finally met in person 2 years ago. We went up to New York, in Wallkill, New York, which is a strange place to have a prison, but that's where he's housed, in the Shawanagon. And we sat down and interviewed him for 2.5 hours. And like Laura, it's really interesting when you're sitting in a room with a serial killer, especially a very high profile and notorious serial killer, and you're just sitting here talking about things and issues. And it was, needless to say, it was a fascinating experience, and we're actually planning on following up with him sometime in 2024.
Well, listen, if he's willing to help, we know he's taken a turn, and he's become very religious, and what else can you do at that point?
I tell people all the time that give me very quizzical of, how could you do that? You're a victim, and I said, you know what? Isn't he doing something that you would want somebody to do in prison? He's repentant, he's remorseful, he's trying to offering something back to society, and he's found a tool and a valve through me in Houston. So, he's not asking to get out. He's not asking for favors. So, that's how it works.
So with the information that you get from him, how does that help you? I just want to clarify
when I first started researching this whole issue, the big question was, how does this begin? How did these items get out? How do dealers eventually convince serial killers and mass murder? How do they convince them to send items? Are they aware of it? Are they making money of it? And that's why early on I sent out letters to 20 high-profile serial killers, and I was very upfront who I am, what I do, and surprisingly, I got 12 responses back, and 2 of them really stood out. One was Berkowitz, another was one of the Manson girls, Susan Atkins, that were absolutely shocked and appalled that people were selling our items without their consent. So Berkowitz took it a step further. He actually gave me a notarized affidavit to use in my testimony, and it doesn't get any better when you're actually reading a statement from who all the profiting laws are named after, who's absolutely against this. You can't script that. So because he gets requests from dealers. And kind of give you an example. There was a company in Ohio that, believe it or not, was developing serial killer greeting cards. And they sent Berkowitz a prototype, basically wanting his thumbs up and approval. And Berkowitz shipped the entire package to me. The serial killer greeting card company didn't end up actually producing the cards as a result.
Did you contact them?
Oh, absolutely. I put them through hell.
Give us
an example. Like, we just want to understand like how you're stopping this, because this is a very big thing.
I learned very early on in my career the media would be my most powerful weapon, a tool, an ally, and if properly used, is a agent of change. So I have relationships with local and national media, and the issue of murderabilia, of course, was tailor-made, and nobody knew this was going on except for me. And when I finally decided I was going to out the industry, I knew exactly what I was going to do. ABC's 2020 did an entire segment on this issue. They actually filmed me testifying before a legislative body on this. So I basically told, the company, which was Morbid Curiosity, if you continue to attempt to put these on the market, whatever else your company is going to do, I'm also going to put you on the market as well. So you have two choices. Either you back off or I'm going to expose you. And it's up to you. I'm flexible. I'll go either way, but it's your choice.
Well, good. We're very, very happy you're doing that.
Exactly. Like I said, everyone that we've talked to over the years who've been victims of crimes, even close friends who's had, a good friend of ours had her sister was murdered, and the person that murdered their sister wrote a book, and then they were selling the book. It was just ridiculous. And so we're really happy to hear that this is your life's work and that we can expose this, because this is a topic that Rob and I have been talking about for a while, not on the air.
I've always been of the perspective, I'm a firm believer in free enterprise and capitalism, don't get me wrong, but I think you got to draw the line somewhere, and you just shouldn't be able to rob, rape, and murder, then turn around and make a buck off of it. It's really that simplistic to me.
Exactly. And that's what's been so disturbing about this for so long. And I guess my question is, why would people be interested in this? Have you guys had any headway into understanding the motive for these people, of why would they want these things? Like, what is this subculture about? Where is the root of it?
Laura, do you have I'll answer that after you, but you've been dealing with your guys, so.
I haven't done a deep dive into that subculture. I know BITTAKER and Norris are notorious for selling stuff, especially Norris. He made a lot of paintings. He even made a painting of a Cindy Schaefer of the victims and them driving victims up in the mountains. Some really, really grotesque, morbid paintings. But I haven't really dived into the subculture and the need or desire to really have these kind of artifacts.
I can tell you several things. Number one, like it or not, and as you guys well know, there's groups of people out there, small groups, thankfully, I believe, that idolize serial killers and high-profile killers. And if you can get something that they've personally made, you basically own a piece of their soul. It becomes a huge collector's item, and frankly, it for some, it becomes a major source of income. You have 7 dealers throughout the country that operate websites selling items that they obtain from serial killers, mass murderers, and anyone else who has name recognition. So if you think about it, the entire true crime industry is exploding as we know it right now. So everybody's enthralled with it, and it's just human nature. And this is just another little part of it. When you can actually say, hey, I have a painting by John Wayne Gacy, or I have, a sketch that was made by Charles Manson. So that's really what it is out there. It's a talking point, and it's a way for people to get what they perceive as closer to that individual that has achieved notoriety from committing some of the worst crimes in this country's history.
How many, I don't even know if you have these statistics, but how many people are buying these things? Like, is there a number of sales?
Yeah, if you go, you can actually look at some of the websites. You can see items that are sold. At one point, eBay used to be the major conduit for selling items, and I had a very interesting 2-year battle with eBay. And finally, in a very interesting story, 2 weeks before 2020 was scheduled to air their segment on murderabilia, when eBay sent out a news release stating they will no longer allow the sale of murderabilia out of respect for victims' families. The timing of their news release release, and the airing of the 2020 story was merely coincidental, they said. So what happened was the dealers that primarily sold on eBay simply scurried off and ended up structuring their own websites for sale. And that's kind of where we are right now. So, I mean, you can actually look at people bidding on items and things of that nature. So, it's just the nature of our culture. We're fascinated with the serial killers. We're fascinated with those who commit these types of crimes. And this is just another facet or a different tributary of the whole issue of true crime.
So, Laura, tell us a little bit about your and Andy's, when you met at CrimeCon. What was the thing that you guys gelled together and felt like you could kind of help each other out?
Well, I would say it was we talked about, Elmer Wayne Henley initially because I had interviewed him. But I also, once I found out he was a board member, I told him about Cindy and Andrea and possibly if he could be a person who could help, get the recovery of these girls.
So, Andy, when you heard about Cindy and Andrea, what were your thoughts about?
My first thought is, I'll be more than happy. I'll talk with Tim and, we'll be more than happy to do whatever we do. Of course, the issue is, obviously getting us up there and seeing what we can do with our equipment, with our volunteers. And like anything else, it costs. So there's the issue of funding as well. But I can unequivocally tell you still to this day that, Texas EQUUSEARCH is willing, they'll do whatever it can. And if we can make this happen, we will make it happen. So we had that. And then, of course, the issue of Elmer Wayne Henley in the Houston mass murders, there's been rumors for years that there were more than 28 bodies. And we actually had 3 bodies that were unnamed. Thankfully, thanks to a very incredible forensic examiner, we've been able to identify 2 of the bodies. So there's still 1 body who sadly doesn't have a name attached to it. So the question is, whether or not Henley will give specific information regarding that without a quid pro quo, that remains to be seen. But the fact that Laura has communication with Henley at least gives us some insight into perhaps he can shed some of the answers, whether or not there are bodies or not, and if he's willing to provide the answers without asking for anything in return.
Girl, real talk. This whole "it's a new year, time to reinvent myself" trash is not the vibe for 2024. You can find someone who loves you for you, as you are. You don't need to read a stack of self-help books, only eat sad salads, or start meditating at 5 a.m. to be ready for dating. So yeah, my advice is to download Bumble and find someone who embraces you the way you are right now. Let me know how it goes.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
That's what we're hoping for.
I have a question. So you've been doing this for 20 plus years. And the one thing that, we've been doing I've been doing true crime since, probably about the same amount of time. Mm-hmm. But the more or less just kind of highlighting the true crime professionals, police officers, correctional officers, detectives, and looking into cases. But it's only been for, in the last, 10 years where there's been a wave of people who want to see these past crimes solved. In the past, it's like as soon as they've gotten a conviction, like with BITTAKER and Norris, they don't really care about the other victims anymore. They got convictions for a few of the crimes and the murders, and we all know, based upon all the information Laura's yielded and people she's spoken to, that there's could be a lot more victims out there. And where is their peace? Where is their resolution? And also that the fact that there's a lot, it also takes unsolved cases off the books as well. What do you think is law enforcement's reasoning, other than just lack of resources, for not exploring that stuff that already has information? Like the mountains of discovery of information that Laura has sent us and that she's gone over clearly indicate. She just sent us something literally right before we got on the phone call regarding the BITTAKER Norris case and regarding one of the other people that were involved, implicating both him and discovering another victim. And it's clear as day. It's written in there. Why didn't they look at it then? And then why aren't they looking at it now, knowing that these families need resolution? I mean, everybody, we've been talking to all these relatives and friends of people who knew these victims, and they can't believe it. And it's like they don't understand why people don't care about this stuff. Why don't law enforcement care about it?
It's a multifaceted answer. Number one, particularly a lot of these cases involving the serial killers that occurred in the 70s, 80s, and maybe a little bit in the early 90s were embarrassing for law enforcement. Like in the Henley case, all these young boys were categorized as runaways, even though none of them were. So they didn't do anything about them, and families at that time didn't have avenues. And for the most part, you trusted what law enforcement told you. And then to have all that come out years later that there really wasn't much attention given in these cases, it's not a good look for them. So you have to have understanding that, look, we understand what happened in the past, but we're moving forward. We're not part of the blame game. The blame game doesn't get us where we need to get in this day and age. But you've got to know people in the right places. And that's where advocates like myself and Laura play such a significant role, because you've got to be connected to the individuals that can make a difference. So, for example, in my role, I know all the people in government. I know people in the governor's office. I know people in the city council, the mayor. I know all these people. And if there's something that I need to get done, I can simply pick up a call or text or whatever in this day and age, and I'll get it done, because people know who I am as a victim advocate, so they would rather work with me than be on the opposite side of that. So you have to have families that can band together, show up at a city council meeting. You got to make your voices known. You've got to have somebody in a local media that will basically carry the torch, that will get these stories out there. That's how we've ended up with a lot of these cases getting solved down the road, is we put on a campaign. We had a serial killer that we were going to legally release in Texas over a decade ago, and we knew there were unsolved cases connected to him. And we just decided we're going to put him back on the map. And 2 years later, we hit pay dirt with a cold case out of Michigan that was finally attached to him. They ended up charging and convicting him of, and thus meaning he wasn't going to be released from prison. But if we don't do that campaign and get families together, it doesn't happen. So you have to take charge. You have to take the initiative, and don't assume that the governmental officials are going to be working on your behalf. You're basically going to have to push them.
I have a question. Has there ever been any, in your experience, talk or discussion about a national government agency that is only for these types of cases, missing kids, or, most of these cases are missing people. We had a case in Florida where the Kessy family, Jennifer Kessy, disappeared, vanished into thin air, never found her. Parents spent hundreds of thousands of dollars the past 18 years looking for her. Nothing. They even had video of the possible perpetrator, but because the video was so old, it was clicking and you kept missing his face. It's insane. The case is absolutely insane. She's never been found. It's mind-boggling to me that this happens in the United States. So we've always been discussing, amongst other true crime people that we talk to and whatnot, about the advantages of having a national missing persons unsolved unit that was only for these types of cases. Because like you said, those boys in Texas, originally they were just runaways. The same with Molly and Colt. They said they were runaways. Jennifer Kessy, she just took off. That's usually what they say, and that's usually not the case. So I was wondering, is there a platform for creating a national agency that's specifically designed just for this?
That's actually a great idea, and I'll tell you what, you've got a presidential election coming up next year, and I would start approaching the candidates and whoever the presumed candidates were, and I would see if you can get them to start talking about this. Okay. This is absolutely, timing is everything. Yeah. And the time is ripe for that with a national election coming up. Mm-hmm. And also, even in California, you've got senator elections, you got something of that magnitude. So it's a great idea, and I'll be happy to also explore it as well.
Great.
Yeah. No, because I was astonished when I did just a cursory Google search like months ago on how many people go missing yearly in unsolved cases. And it's like, it's in the hundreds of thousands. And it's like, where are all those people? And they're only recovering they said they only recover out of that hundreds and hundreds of thousands, like maybe like a couple thousand out of all those. There's a huge gap right there.
But also for us, we could talk about this forever. We could do a bunch of documentaries about these things, but Rob and I, when we decided to do this podcast, we did it because we wanted to make some change and to have some kind of policy change that would stop this from happening in the future. So if we could get some movement on this idea, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
No, put together some ideas in a bullet points, email it to me, and I'll start talking to my connections as well. I think it's a great idea. I've always said that, we need a national database, particularly in this era of criminal justice reform where we're releasing people on no bail.
Absolutely.
Go out and get charged with murder.
Absolutely.
We need to know. I've always said that in my social media posts as well. We need something to keep up with what we're doing. We've actually, in my role here, we started noticing that trend in Houston, and I started documenting offenders who've been out on multiple felony bonds or a personal recognizance bond that were charged with murder, and I started keeping track of all this, and we're about up to 196 people in the last 3 years that fit that category.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy that in this day and age that it can still happen. And it seems like you would think at this point there would be systems in place to kind of handle that stuff, but it's almost like we've taken, with the way law enforcement has taken a beating over the last couple of years, we've taken huge steps backwards in that arena. And I think hopefully the pendulum is going to start swinging the other way, where these victims of these crimes, these street crimes, and we have a friend who lives in Hell's Kitchen in New York, and she's been just repeatedly attacked on the street, punched in the face while just walking down the street. And she's a very fit person, and she's not a shrinking violet, so she doesn't project someone who's weak, and that person just continues walking, and she gets up and she has to go.
I've always said the amount of people who are being victimized under the guise of criminal justice reform over the last few years is going to set this country back for decades, particularly in law enforcement and victims' rights. Crime victims are the only unwilling participants in the criminal justice system. Everyone else chooses their role. Law enforcement, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, victim advocates, but no one ever said, pick me, pick me. I want to be a victim of a crime. So you would think the least you would do, particularly in government, is to be looking out for victims' rights, their well-being, their due process, and putting their lives back together again. But basically, they're the forgotten element of this entire system.
Absolutely. And the way that they're treated sometimes, like the Kesey family, what these poor people went through and what Paula went through. And it's just devastating. And we've been friends with them now ever since we took their cases on, and we try every year to help and, do something. But I feel like the only way anything's going to happen is if we do a national advocacy for this. It has to become more of a platform for people and victims to have a voice.
You have to realize that there's people out there such as Laura and myself that are willing to speak out on behalf of people and victims. I once told a parole board member many years ago, I said, look, we can do this the right way, or I'll see you on the 6 o'clock news. You pick, and I'll do it.
Yeah. And now we don't even have to wait for the 6 o'clock news, which is great. So we can, perfect example is when we took on Paula's case with Molly and Colt, she was at her wit's end. She had been working on it for over 10 years and being an advocate for her cousin there. And basically got passed around through all the different law enforcement agencies. And as we started looking into it, we realized how corrupt the law enforcement agencies in that area were. And so we tried to bring a microscope to that, and we were able to get the Bureau of Indian Affairs eventually taking the case. And now they're taking the case, and we've kind of taken a step backwards to just kind of give them space to do it. But even them, the agent who's in charge of that has a case file of probably about 2,000 cases, and it's just him. So it's how do you deal with that? And he's dealing with also the indigenous population too, which the missing persons and unidentified people there is it's crazy there too. The numbers are crazy.
Well, when we did the West Mesa serial killings a few years back, and it was so disturbing how many victims are out there that have never been even discussed or even mentioned, and because most of them are indigenous. But it's very scary that this goes on in our society. But to go back to the serial killer, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, as far as I was saying, I'm honored and blessed to be able to do what I do and advocate for those who truly need a voice. And it's very rare to have somebody like Laura or myself that is actually willing to, quote, think outside the box and actually address these issues and live to tell about it.
Absolutely. 100% we agree. And we love Laura, and that's why we've been cultivating this relationship for the past almost 2 years now, trying to get her voice out there properly so that people really understand what she's doing.
There's very few of us, and, I kind of tongue-in-cheek call us the Guardians of the Galaxy.
You are.
You are. But I have a question about the serial killer in Houston that you were discussing, and Laura, you had spoken to. Can you tell us a little bit about this person and what you learned when you did talk to him?
Oh, or Elmer Wayne Henley?
Yes.
Yeah, his case is very unique because he was only 14 years old when he came across the serial killer known as Dean out of Texas. And it's a very disturbing case. This serial killer was grooming young boys. He groomed Elmer Wayne Henley and another boy into the commission of his crimes. And they would pick up other young boys, and the boys would always get in the car thinking it was safe because there was other young boys in there. And he would force them to actually rape and kill and torture, just like Bittaker and Norris, the victims. So he kind of stole the innocence of these kids and groomed them into killers.
And what did you yield when you spoke to him, the killer?
Well, I talked to Wayne was one of the boys who's 14 who got taken in. So we've had a lot of discussions about grooming. His childhood where his father wasn't around, and he was looking for that older male. And of course, just like every predator, they look for that weakness and take them in. And he saw that within Wayne. But Wayne has told me there are a lot more victims, as Andy was stating, that Dean had killed and that have not been recovered.
How does he know that?
This is just from stuff Dean has told him.
Got it.
So when they were actually caught, the police had come, Wayne actually shot Dean and killed him. So they did like a whole excavation of the farm, and they recovered, I think it was, what was it, Andy, 30 bodies? And they 28, yes, for the original excavation. But Wayne even said there's way more out there connected to Dean.
Wow. And what year was this?
This was 1970 through 73.
Wow.
Henley, basically, his role, he and another fellow groomer, person that was groomed by Cora, they basically recruited young boys under the guise that they were going to go to the house, have parties and drink beer and smoke and all that good stuff. So Dean Coral couldn't do this himself because he's in his 30s, so he needed younger people like Henley to go out and bring his victims to him. So basically, Henley was the one that procured and knowingly marched all these boys to their death. And it was a very sadistic, cruel, horrible form of being killed, with sadistically sexual torture, including having a torture board. And so this was not a very easy death that these boys had to go through.
So sad.
It's horrible. It's horrible. All right, so Andy, tell us a little bit about what does the future of Crime Stoppers look like? How does it, how has it evolved into the next century?
Well, I hope, like I said earlier, that since we're the largest in the country, we're the only one with an actual victim services department, which is myself. I would hope that we would be the prototype and set precedent for other Crime Stoppers to also recognize that they can step outside of being just a tip line, that they can offer the community a lot more services. And so I'm hoping that, this trend of me being the first will eventually, pinball, and other cities will also end up doing like we do. So it's an amazing group. It's an amazing organization. We have the largest staff that we've ever had right now, 20 people. But again, we're a nonprofit. People think that we're actually part of law enforcement. Obviously we work very closely with law enforcement. I work very closely on the unsolved cases. If you go to our website, we have an entire section of solved crime, from wanted suspects to unsolved crimes we do a weekly segment called To Catch a Killer, where we feature every week someone who's wanted for a murder, and we use all forms of social media to get these issues out. So that's what we're hoping, is that we're going to be the trendsetter for other Crime Stoppers throughout the country.
That's fantastic. I think that's fantastic. We'll help promote that as well on our end. But I wanted to ask you a question about, you said you have a great relationship with law enforcement. We've always had a great relationship with law enforcement too, but it's case depending and it's department depending. We've had situations where we've had law enforcement come to us saying, we don't have the resources to look at this cold case. Would you help us? Would you mind taking a deep dive into it? We'll give you the information. So we just don't have the bandwidth. And then on the other side of it, we have complete resistance and not wanting to, i.e., share information. And we're not talking about cases that are current. We're talking about cold cases that have been sitting on the shelf for years, that have basically are considered an open case, so they can kind of withhold information, but they haven't done anything. Open investigation.
Yeah, I'll give you an example where, obviously in my 30 plus years, I've learned how to walk that line and how to balance recognizing that I have to do work with these entities, yet at the same time, I also have to be an advocate for victim families. And you're absolutely right. Occasionally those lines do clash. We have a case and I'll send it to you. It's 40 years old. 3 Houston area realtors were murdered at their realty at their actual business on a Friday afternoon. And you would have thought that would have been huge news. And I was shocked when I found out how little coverage that it got. And this case was brought to my attention. I tracked down the daughter of one of the victims, and I'll never forget when I called her, she said, when you called me, said I was driving and I had to pull over because no one has contacted our family in over 25 years about this case.
Wow.
So I was when someone actually reached out to us. So we put this case kind of back on the map because I'm going, 3 realtors murdered in their business. That's huge. I don't understand how you can just, put this under the carpet. So they've met with some resistance from the local entity, the law enforcement that was in charge of investigating the case, because they want some of these testings that are now available done, and it's costly. And the agency is balking at the cost. So I basically have sent them down to city council. I've reached out to the U.S. Senator about this. And actually, I was with them yesterday because we had our annual holiday memorial tree ceremony in which we place victims' ornaments, personalized ornaments, on several trees that remain up at CrimeStoppers. So we're hopeful now, because we have a new mayor coming in, we have a new city council coming in, different law enforcement that will be in the upper echelon of command. And as I told them, now's the time we're going to strike.
That's good. Well, that's fantastic. That's fantastic that you're so determined and you're not afraid of these, because that's the way we realize we have to be. We can't be afraid of people's opposition to this, even if no matter where they are in the echelon of law enforcement or government.
One thing I've learned in my decades is when you advocate on behalf of one faction, you will generally infuriate the other faction, and that just comes with the territory. And you have to recognize you're not going to please everybody. Mm-hmm. And if you were, you ain't worth a damn.
Yeah.
It's just,
Exactly. You can't. It's you have to take your stance and you have to follow it through. We've had to battle against resistance many times just to find the truth. You at least get some headway on it, especially with Molly and Colt.
Yeah.
That case has taken over our lives for the past couple of years.
Exactly.
No, it is. It's all consuming and engulfing, and you can imagine if you want answers, you can imagine how the family feels. And like that family I was just talking about, it's been 40 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you never get answers. I mean, that's the thing. I mean,
no, but if I don't get answers, I want to know I went down screaming, kicking, fighting, and giving everything I got, and I didn't leave anything unturned.
Exactly. That was just
right.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Even if you don't get the answers, at least you put up a good fight.
It's not going to be for lack of effort. Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of effort, I want to create a hypothetical here. And because, as you said, Andy said, you'd be willing to come out to help Laura and us look for those bodies that we were talking about earlier. And let's just talk about what that would take. And then, Laura, from your end, I'll start with you first, Laura. What do you think we would need in order to do a recovery effort? And then, Andy, I'd like you to follow up with that. And what do you think would help that situation, and what kind of effort?
I was going to say, well, definitely metal detectors because of, the ice pick still being embedded into the girls' bones. Skeletalized, trained cadaver dogs, I think, could also help us lead, at least in the direction of where the bones could be, because they're going to be scattered down the cliffside. But those are the two things I think that are really going to help lead us to the girls' remains.
I think ground penetrating drones, too, we were talking about.
Ground penetrating
radar.
And then what are your thoughts there, Andy?
My thoughts is we would initially set up a conference call with Tim, because I defer to Tim on his expertise on conducting these searches. And if there's anyone that's going to know the answers and what they need and how they're going to go about doing it, it's Tim Miller. And I can easily broker that.
Okay.
Yeah, I know he has the wherewithal. I mean, he came out a couple times for.
And like I said, you might not find anything, but at least you'll make that effort.
Absolutely. You got to try.
At least you'll say, we went out there, we exhausted, all our resources. And if we find something, great. And if we don't, at least we know we gave it the one for all.
With BITTAKER especially, since he drew her a map, we've dealt with this before with Gary Ridgway and the Green River Killer, where we had the family of the Green River, their niece worked for me, and we were doing a documentary, and we were trying to recover some of the victims and through what he was telling us. And I think he was just sending us on a wild goose chase. But with what BITTAKER gave Laura, we feel like is much more concrete.
And Laura, she already
And
took.
when he gave her the information, did he also discuss it verbally as well? So is there any like verbal
Oh yeah,
recording?
hundreds of recordings of him talking about the area. And I also took Andrea Hall's sister up to the mountains with a metal detector, and I did a sweep of the whole road, about a mile long. There was no hit across the road, but then I went to the spot where he had placed Andrea, and that was the only spot we got a metal detector hit.
I'm sure Tim would like to, listen to that as well.
Yeah, and Laura documented it too on video, so she actually has the area where it was hit. So we definitely need to go back up there.
My advice would be to put this to bed one way or the other, is to get them involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we'll definitely do that, and we'll definitely give Tim a call on your behalf, and then also talk to you. And see, once we put together a plan and a timing, because as we know that this all takes. We did this once before in Oklahoma, where we put together a team of ex-FBI agents and also Cheryl Mack McCullum. We flew them out there to do this, and we basically drained this pond and dug in it with a backhoe for 2 days. And because the dogs, we had 3 separate federally trained cadaver dogs at 3 different times over a 6-month period hit in the same area. So that's what we have to do.
No, absolutely. Sounds like a plan. So let's follow up, and we'll see what we can all do to make this happen.
Absolutely. And I'd love to talk to you offline a little bit more about your Crime Stoppers, because I think what you're doing over there is pretty amazing, and probably we'd be more than happy to kind of help promote that, and as well as.
Let me ask you a quick question on the Crime Stoppers, where you're at in the BITTAKER area, which I'm assuming would be the Los Angeles Crime Stoppers. Would that be correct?
That'd be Los Angeles.
It would be interesting to see if they would, and again, I see no harm in doing this, but if they would be willing to put out a reward for any information leading out to, if you don't know. But my position's always been, if you don't try, you don't know. But you never know. Maybe someone out there would know something and would want to give a tip anonymously.
Yeah. No, explain to me, how does that work, the network of Crime Stoppers? I mean, is it each individual city and area is all individually run?
Correct.
It's like a franchise?
Yeah, correct. We're all independent. For like the Houston one's been up and running since 1984. So there's different Crime Stoppers, different ways that they go about enacting rewards, putting out reward flyers. So we're one of the few, probably if only, Crime Stoppers in the country, again, that will actually put out a reward for a missing person as long as that person has presumed to have gone missing as a result of criminal conduct. And that's the key language that we have to have.
Yeah, because we feel like that's a problem too, because a lot of times law enforcement won't even look into it until 48 hours after, if they've been missing with no contact. Is that correct?
Generally, in the cases of adults, yes. So we put out missing person as long as we get the okay from law enforcement. And again, as long as they're of the perspective that that person went missing as a result of criminal conduct. Otherwise, you can well imagine trying to put these out for anybody missing. We would just be inundated.
No, I get it. But I think there is a time where, with how technology has really kind of identified where people are at every moment, you could probably reduce that 48-hour window. Because most people, when we know, just yesterday morning, my neighbor called me, and he was at work, and his wife with 2 young kids, she wasn't answering the phone, and he was panicked. He goes, "I've been calling her for an hour, and she's not answering. Can you go over there and knock on the door?" And it was a simple thing. She had her ringer turned off, but from his perspective, he was thinking the worst, but he knew exactly where his wife was, and he's still, So it's we know where pretty much everybody is all the time. I know where my wife is when if she goes to the store, I know where she's going. I can track her phone. We know where people are, even my kids and stuff like that. So it's if they're not where they're supposed to be, and we can't validate where they are instantaneously, you can pretty much, and you have no contact with them over the phone, you can pretty much assume that maybe something bad happened to him. So I think it's a little different than it was years ago.
And again, that's a good point. And different departments and administrations, should be looking at to basically what I would say get out of the Stone Age and move into the modern day that we're dealing with. So it's the old battle, sometimes trying to change things that have been ingrained in stone for, centuries and decades. Sometimes you got to step on toes to do it, and sometimes the toes are willing, and sometimes they'll bite back.
Yeah.
What information can you offer potential victims' families? Because I think this is a great place to really talk about that, because there's no like cheat sheet on what you should do if your family member or loved one has been a victim of a killer or a crime or stuff like that. What kind of guidance can you give these potential victims' families on how to deal with law enforcement at those first moments of something like this happening?
Well, we actually have something that we give to families. And as a member of Parents of Murdered Children and Surviving Family Members of Homicide, we actually meet every month at Crime Stoppers. And so actually our next meeting will be this Tuesday night. We meet the second Tuesday of every night. The meetings are also generally attended by local law enforcement agencies as well. So there's a great communication that we have between families of loved ones who've gone murder, whose cases have been unsolved, and the law enforcement community as well. So we make sure that law enforcement has the proper resources to give to a family, kind of like a blue card, we call it, with information that's readily available.
That's great, but as far as the family members, what can they do to increase their chances of, number one, law enforcement really looking into it, and number two, how they should prepare themselves for the eventuality of something really bad happening?
Well, again, like anything else, in order for us to get involved as Crime Stoppers, there has to be some police incident report reported. Now, if there's not, then I have other ways with all the different organizations that I work with. I'm connecting people to the right resource and organization. And then I always, like I said, local media, I'm almost a fixture on local media. So if there's something out there, I can simply call one of my reporter friends and say, hey, I got something for you I want you to take a look at. So that's generally how it can work. That's how it works in Houston.
Great. Fantastic. Well, this has been awesome.
Oh,
Andy.
So wonderful speaking with you, Andy. And thank you so much for the ideas. And also, we will be in touch regarding creating something to push policy on national agencies for missing people, because I really feel in my bones this has to happen.
Yeah, I can't see why anybody would be opposed to something like this.
I agree with you in theory, but I also I'm cynical. I'm a cynical New Yorker at heart. So to me, what sounds good on paper, generally you'd be shocked at who might oppose it. But, as I'm fond of saying, when I'm pushing for an issue and an organization like the ACLU is against it, then I know I'm on firm ground.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it just needs visibility. It needs visibility, and you just got to be loud.
Yeah, and there's no harm in putting it out there for public debate. Zero.
Absolutely. Yeah, tell us why you wouldn't want it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then when they can't come up with any answers, then they'll say, well, there's no money and there's no resources. Okay, what if we raise the money? Okay, what do we have the money? We're spending all this money on all these other things.
Yep, there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you push it, and it's always been amazing to me that the ideas that we come up with, particularly myself, I knew that the agencies were readily aware of it, but they just don't want to put it out there. So it's incumbent upon people like myself to do that. But it's always amazed me that you knew this was going on, but you just don't want to do anything about it.
Well, they're just so overwhelmed. I mean, even in LA County, and we've in the last month, they had four different LA Sheriff Department personnel who committed, long, like 20-year veterans commit suicide, like all on the same day. And one of the family's wives came out. She goes, it was a direct result of all the defund the police and the fact that they're working so much overtime and they're
negativity on law enforcement the last few years will have reverberations throughout decades in the country.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, we're very thankful for you to being on the podcast. We're continuing. We'll definitely continue to with this relationship, and we'll keep you abreast of what we're going to be doing up here with the search, and we'll be all
do that. And if you want to keep up with me, I'm very vocal on social media. That's how it's easier for me to let people know what's going on. I'm always putting stuff on my Facebook page, on Crime Stoppers Facebook page, and the same thing with Twitter as well. So if you want to know what we're up to, the issues that we're involved with, or how people can, as I like to say, action mode, here's what I need people to do, then follow me on social media.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care, kiddo.
Bye-bye.
You bet.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Next time on Partners in True Crime.
On this season of Partners in True Crime, The Serial Killer Whisperer, we will be following Laura Brand's incredible journey as she continues her groundbreaking study on serial killers.
Each week, we will release never-before-heard recordings of her conversations with the most notorious killers in hopes to get answers for the victims' families, and maybe that could lead to recovering their lost remains.
Please visit our website where you can subscribe to the podcast, find show notes, and check out extra content from all of our podcasts. All rights reserved. This has been a production of 722 Media Content.